Hi, I'm Michael Siddle.
And I'm Nick Nanos.
And welcome to Trendline. So they're still counting the votes at the US election, but newly declared President-elect Joe Biden got a late push from mail-in ballots.
All right, CTV News is calling an election win for Democrat Joe Biden as results come in from Pennsylvania. I'll repeat that. Former Vice President Joe Biden has just won the presidency of the United States, pulling off a narrow win in Pennsylvania. Biden has been pushed over the benchmark of 270 electoral college votes.
Well, the thing is, we talked about, when we talked about the polling in one of the previous Trendline podcasts, and what it showed is that if someone was saying that they were voting on election day, they're more likely to vote for Trump. If they're voting in the mail ballots, they're much more likely to vote for Biden. And remember, we talked about this. We said election night, the polls are going to look wrong. People are going to be clutching their chests. They're going to be angry, and because Trump will be much more competitive than people thought, and then the mail ballots will be counted. And even though there's been a declared winner, I was looking at some states like New York State, they're still counting ballots. I think there's still 40% of the ballots that still need to be counted in New York State, and that's one of the big states that's also very big for the Democrats. So we'll probably see a little movement, a little more positive Biden movement in the top numbers when everything is completely counted.
So we'll do a full breakdown when everything's been counted, which, as you just said, Nick, will take a while. I think they're also heading towards a recount in Georgia because things are so tight there. And we're also going to see two Senate runoff races there as well, which is pretty interesting. So in terms of state polling, because in the previous episode you said that we really had to be careful with state polls, some of them in the states. How did they do in this election?
Well, when we look at the state polls compared to the national polls, the state polls, a lot of them really missed the mark. The other interesting thing is that there's been a proliferation of polling that has been done in the U.S. Presidential election. And when we look at the breakdown, about 80% of those polls were online surveys. Only about 14% were random telephone surveys of land and cell lines, which is the way Nanos does our ballot tracking. And what we saw is that a lot of those state polls relied on online samples, and they just did not hit the mark as well as a lot of the telephone surveys did. And actually, there was a recent blog post by Claire Durant from the University of Montreal. She's a quantitative methods survey professor I have a lot of time and respect for. And she crunched the numbers and suggested that the telephone survey, we talked about polling being wrong. Well, the telephone surveys were actually much closer to the mark. There was one that I follow, I think it's called IBD, IBD TIP, only had a 4-point margin. Their election call was a 4-point margin. And it looks like that's probably where we're going to land, a 4-point margin between Biden and Trump. So that pollster also did well and has a pretty good long-term election track record. So maybe the one thing that we've learned is not all methodologies are equal, and that some did a little better job, a much better job than some of the others, which showed a big Biden lead.
It's always a fascinating question. How do you reach out to people? I mean, in these modern times with online messaging and et cetera, but just random phone calls, it still seems to be the most successful way.
Yeah, well, the thing is that when we look at the coverage, can I put my propeller hat on? Just
yep.
Yeah, I'm a loser anyways. But anyways, if we talk about that, we always talk from a research perspective on coverage. So what we do know is that in Canada and the United States, the coverage, when you look at landlines and cell lines, both of those combined, is nearly 100%. It's like 99%, which means that everyone in the United States and in Canada pretty well has either a landline. If they don't have a landline, they have a cell line in order to be reached. But internet access is a little different. Internet access is a lot lower in rural areas compared to urban areas. This could have created a natural bias in favor of Joe Biden because a lot of those rural areas do not have the same type of internet service and internet coverage as those high density urban areas where the Democrats do well. So, in a way, the online pollsters, and Nanos does online surveys too, because there's a good time and place for online surveys. But they're a bit hostage to coverage, and that could probably account for part of the difference between that particular way of doing a survey and other ways of doing a survey to measure ballot support.
Now the results are so close in some of these battlegrounds. I mean, it took days to call Pennsylvania. Clearly, it seems to be fueling this misinformation now about whether the vote's been legitimate, and President Donald Trump still has yet to concede. So what can we expect from him until Inauguration Day?
Well, I think we should expect what he said he would do. He said he will be president until the day that he leaves the White House. That it's pretty clear. He said that in the very first presidential debate. I thought it was quite interesting. So he does not consider himself a caretaker president. He does not consider himself a lame duck president. He considers himself as someone who can exercise the full authority of the presidency until the very end, and until Joe Biden is sworn in as president. So this is going to be very different from other transitions, because other transitions, Michael, have been very genteel. There'd be like a session speech, and then there'd be like a nice meeting, or it might not be nice, but there'd be at least a kind of a cordial meeting where the outgoing president might give advice to the incoming president. And we know that happened with Trump, right? He talked about his meeting with Barack Obama, and they talked about North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that's going to happen this time, because the person that's leaving thinks that they won the election and that it's been stolen from them, and that's their primary narrative. So I think I don't think anyone that thinks that Donald Trump's going to be a little bit of a policy wallflower is sadly mistaken. He's going to be full throttle, 100% president until the very last day that he leaves the White House.
We've also seen him continue to fire people and sort of change, positions in the Trump administration. I think there was a Department of Defense person who just got fired. So I guess lots to happen in the weeks ahead.
Maybe it's going to be, hey Michael, I think it's going to be like the Apprentice episode, like except even worse.
Oh brother!
Like the government of the United States would be like, hey, you're not going to do what I want you to do. You're fired. Oh. And that's probably what we're going to see. But the thing is that's for Donald Trump. That's to character. Mm-hmm. Throughout his presidential administration, whenever anyone has not done what he's wanted them to do, he has fired them. That's the way he runs his business operations. That's the way he was president. That's probably the way he's going to continue over the next while in the last part of his presidency. So he's still going to have a lot of eyeballs. Plus, he's still going to be tweeting. So as long as he's tweeting, he's still a big factor out there and something to manage for all of his allies, including Canada.
Now, Trump joins a handful of one-term presidents, but do you think there's any chance that he will stay in politics and maybe even make a future run for the presidency again?
Yeah, can we bring out the history reel, like
the time machine again?
I don't know. If we can grab let's put Grover Cleveland up on the screen. I never thought I'd ever say that.
Grover Cleveland, who was not only the 22nd president of the United States, he was the 24th president of the United States. So could Trump pull a Grover? Are we going to call it a Grover? Or pulling a Grover sounds pretty good.
Yeah. So could Trump do that? There's already speculation now that one of the reasons why he's contesting the election is to maintain his control over the Republican Party, and that either he might run again or one of the Trump children might run as a candidate. And the other thing that a lot of people underestimate in terms of his current power over the Republican Party is the fact that his campaign actually did an exceptional job at turning out the vote. And down ticket, right? Down ticket are the people above there's the president at the top of the ticket, and then it's like governor, and then the state races for the Senate and the House. Down ticket Republicans in those states and counties benefited from the Donald Trump turnout machine, and they owe him. So I don't think he's, I don't think by any stretch he's a lame duck within the Republican Party. And considering the number, he got more votes than he did in 2016.
Yeah,
still a factor, and I think for a lot of those voters, They might not necessarily all be Republicans, but they're definitely 100% Trump supporters
Yeah.
because of what he's accomplished.
And we didn't quite see, I mean, we didn't see the US House of Representatives gain seats. I think they're down. They were actually beaten back by a few. And the Senate, I think there were some expectations among some Democratic supporters that they may take control of the Senate. But, I think the best they can hope for now is a 50-50 split with the vice president.
That's why Mitch McConnell is saying stuff to support the president, because he needs the president's support and in order to stay the leader of the Senate. Assuming that the Republicans hold on. So it's much more complex. At the top it looks, at the top you think, okay, he's done, right?
Yeah.
He's done, he's finished, and then you kind of look at it as like, no, he's not done. He's going to govern as president till the last day of his mandate. There are Republicans that owe him their political success because of his ability to turn out the vote in a lot of these Republican districts. And I would expect that he's still going to exercise his influence as long as he can.
Meanwhile, President-elect Joe Biden is already working on his COVID-19 plan because, in late January, when he takes office, he'll want to hit the ground running. North of the border here in Canada, we're also seeing cases rise. This week, the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, urged provinces to act.
I would hope that no leader in our country is easing public health vigilance because they feel pressure not to shut down businesses or slow down our economy. I understand that worry, but let me tell you, that's how we end up with businesses going out of business and the economy damaged even more. Beating COVID is the only way to protect our economy.
So, Nick, we're seeing this pressure on the federal government between economic concerns and health concerns. And the provinces, meanwhile, I think in Ontario, Ontario Premier Doug Ford is wanted to reopen restaurants in Toronto, for example, but at the local level, places like Toronto have decided not to do that. So it seems kind of like a downloading of responsibility at this point, with the Prime Minister asking provinces to act.
Well, the thing is back at the beginning of the pandemic, if we all remember, it was one big happy hug between the federal and provincial governments. Everyone was on the same page. Everyone was supportive of each other. The federal government was pumping not just stimulus into the pockets of Canadians and Canadian enterprises, was helping provincial governments kind of cope with the pandemic. Fast forward, and now we're into November, and what we're seeing is a little more friction. Why don't we say not a lot of friction, but more friction, at least compared to the past. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that a lot of Canadians are frustrated. And in our polling, when we ask Canadians what the top national issues of concern are, you can see definitely a second spike of concern, where upwards of 4 out of every 10 Canadians identify coronavirus as their top national issue of concern. Jobs is at around 12%, healthcare is at around 9%, and so as a result, I think for a lot of Canadians, there's still anxiety on like, how long is this going to work? What do I need to do? And what does this mean for the future? And you look at some of those Ontario numbers in terms of active cases, and they're really starting to increase. But there's one stat that I look at. It has to do with, I know this sounds so morbid, excess mortality rate measured by StatsCan. That is a difference in the number of deaths in Canada for over like this month or one particular month compared to a month ago. And when you look at the trend line prepared by Statistics Canada using the Canadian Health kind of data that's shared, it's quite interesting when you can see that the trend line veer up at the beginning of the pandemic, where there are definitely more excess deaths. But check out the trend line in June, July, and part of August. You can see the number of excess deaths goes down and is the same as the year before. I guess in this particular case, you could argue, and there's a little bit of a spike, at least in the last part of the tracking, but you could argue that the beginning of the pandemic was a pandemic. There were more Canadians that were dying as a result, but that the summer, here's an existential question. If more Canadians aren't passing away, is it really a pandemic that is lethal? And it speaks to the fact that I believe one of the reasons why it's like this, even though the number of cases are up, is because Canadians are doing a better job at responding. The healthcare system is doing a better job at responding. There's social distancing, masks, and all those things that even though the number of cases are going up, the mortality rate at least seems to be under control now, much more than it was at the beginning of the pandemic.
I guess the hope too is I think at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw outbreaks in long-term care homes where more, it was a more vulnerable population was getting it, and therefore the mortality rate was rising. I think we're seeing a bit of that in Manitoba now, but the hope is that we obviously do not see that, over this winter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
To your point, Michael, the bulk of the people that have passed away as a result of the pandemic have been over 60 years of age, remain over 60 years of age. That young people, although they are getting the virus, they're much less likely to be vulnerable and to pass away as a result of getting it.
And also in the mortality rates that you're talking about, which goes beyond anything related to COVID-19, we're also seeing, I guess, the danger is that ICUs reach capacity and the overall healthcare system gets overwhelmed and is unable to deal with other issues, which obviously you have to be careful with.
Yeah,
Ontario
numbers on that front are interesting because about when we look at the trend line, I think in this particular week there were 400 Ontarians that were hospitalized as a result of COVID. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was upwards of 1,000. So even though the cases are much higher than before, the hospitalizations are much less than at the beginning of this.
We're certainly getting better at treating it. CTV National News medical specialist Avis Favreau has done a lot of reporting on amazing advancements in treatment for high-risk COVID-19 cases. So we definitely have come a long way. Nick, I'm just curious about the messaging from our leadership now. It seems like it's sort of a patchwork of across the country of what you should do and what you should not do. I just want to play a clip from CTV Ottawa's Graham Richardson talking to Dr. David Williams.
With all due respect to both of you and to your entire team, I really think everybody has tuned you guys out. Like, I just don't think the behavior is changing, both anecdotally and the numbers. The averages here in Ottawa over 7 days are actually down. But what do you say to the notion, like, Dr. Williams, you're talking about aspirational things, about getting people to change their behavior. I really think they've tuned you out. And how do you get them to not tune you out? Because these numbers are just, they're telling a very different story than what you're talking about.
Well, yeah, I think you raise a good point. What's tuned in, tuned out, or what are people saying, I've had enough, I'm going to do my own thing, and I'm not sure that's me in particular. I think is some concern about generally as people say, well, in other sectors we watch what's going on, we see what's happening south of the border, the portrayal of different perspectives in the media and the social media, and so people are, I think, at best confused on the matter.
So what's your takeaway from this, Nick? Just this sort of confusion over, who you should pay attention to?
Well, one of the key takeaways, and this is the odd part of what's happening more, now we're having public health officials disagreeing with each other, but also disagreeing with pick your government, the Ford government or the federal government. I think this is not good from a public health perspective. To have some healthcare practitioners and experts kind of sniping at others and having differing opinions from whatever the governments are doing, because the governments at least have been saying or advancing a narrative that they listen to the experts. But what do you do if the experts don't agree? And I think that's the problem. And I think what we have to watch out for is that Canadians generally start to tune out to what the experts are saying because they're disagreeing, and that would not be good from a public health perspective or from a public policy perspective. And I think public health officials have to kind of listen to that. In the ideal world, they're on this. For any country to beat and control the pandemic, the country has to be on the same page. They have to be working from the same playbook generally, and to have some certainty. But the problem is that, think of it this way. Why don't we use Ontario as an example? In Ontario, they did, in order to fight an expected second surge, they put in more restrictive measures. They did not allow bars and restaurants to kind of serve indoors.
Mhm.
So people did that, and they respected it because they were told by the public health authorities and the premier that our best science says that we need to close this in order to fight the pandemic. So everybody does this. Congratulations, that's good. However, what we've seen is an increase in the number of cases.
Mhm.
So how do the public health officials and how does the government explain, well, to Ontarians, yeah, you've done everything that we've asked you to do, and there are more cases of COVID now than there ever have been in our tracking, where there's a significant spike. So then people are wondering, wow, these businesses closed for the last number of days. They've taken a hit on their bottom line. They're economically at risk, and it was all for naught because the cases are still going up. And then people would be, I think, rightly saying, if restaurants and bars are a vector for spreading this, what's happening in order to explain the second spike? Because
Right.
obviously they're not a vector, because things are still moving in the wrong direction.
Now, and what does your polling have to say about economic concerns overall? I think the airline industry is still hoping for sectoral bailout. Are Canadians comfortable this winter with more funding?
Well, the thing is that we track economic sentiment on behalf of Bloomberg News every week. We ask Canadians a pretty simple question. Do you think in the next 6 months, will the economy get stronger, weaker, will be the same? About 13% of Canadians believe that the economy will get stronger in the next 6 months. A whopping 57% believe that the economy will get weaker. They're more pessimistic by a factor of 4 to 1. And I think a lot of this has to do with the uncertainty. The transition from CERB and that program to the new government employment program, and also uncertainty related to, will my job be there? Will my employer still be there? If my job is still there, will there be fewer hours? How long will these government programs continue? And all that uncertainty speaks to a significantly high level of pessimism when it comes to the future strength of the Canadian economy.
Yeah. Nick, we had a packed show this week. We went through a lot of stuff, but what's your big takeaway?
Well, my big takeaway right now is, if there was anxiety before, there's going to be hyper anxiety now, because now, with a little more confusion on what's needed to fight the pandemic, there'll be heightened anxiety in terms of people's health, heightened anxiety in terms of the economy. The one piece of good news, we do have one piece of good news, is the
Good.
Pfizer announcement. How's that?
Yes.
Pfizer announced
Yes.
that they have a vaccine that is 90% has 90% efficacy, which is actually quite strong, quite high, if that ends up to hold out. So people will be holding on to that vaccine and potentially other vaccines as a potential piece of good hope. But in the short term, it's going to be pretty bleak.
Nick, as always, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Nick, N-I-K, Nanos, or go to the website, www.nanos.co, to grab all those stats.
And I'm also on Twitter at Michael Stittle, and you can find more information on what we've discussed in this episode also at ctvnews.ca. Thanks for listening.